Nancy hurried down the street, adjusting her blazer as she reached the bus stop near the bustling market. She was on her way to an interview, her heart pounding with a mix of excitement and nervousness. She checked her watch. If the bus came on time, she'd make it. But then, a loud, angry voice cut through the noise of the marketplace. "You old hag, stop wasting my time. Do I look like a fool to you? You can't pay, so get lost." Nancy turned toward the commotion. Nancy turned and saw an elderly woman standing in front of a fruit stall. She was wearing an old but neatly pressed dress, her silver hair tied back in a simple bun. She looked worried and embarrassed. "Please," the old woman said softly. "I lost my wallet. My grandson will bring me some money soon." The fruit vendor, a thick-set woman with a harsh expression, crossed her arms.
"Lies! Do you think I haven't seen your type, liars with lyrics? I don't have time for beggars like you."
Nancy's heart tightened. Why was everyone just watching? People stood nearby, whispering, but no one stepped in to help. Some even chuckled, as if finding humor in the old woman's struggle. The vendor leaned forward, her voice dripping with mockery. "Look at yourself. You're old, slow, and useless. You shouldn't even be out here wasting people's time. No wonder your family doesn't bother taking care of you." Nancy felt a flash of anger. Without thinking, she stepped forward. "That's enough," she said firmly. "You shouldn't speak to an elderly woman like that." The vendor glared at her. "Mind your own business, girl." "It is my business," Nancy shot back. "She just needs a little help, and you're treating her like a thief." Nancy reached into her own purse, pulling out some money. "Here," she said. "I'll buy the fruit for her." The vendor snatched the money from her hand and shoved a small bag of apples toward the old woman. "Take it and leave." Nancy turned to the elderly woman, her anger fading into warmth. "Here, Grandma," she said gently, placing the bag of fruit into her wrinkled hands. The old woman's eyes filled with tears. She touched Nancy's hand with shaky fingers. "Thank you, my dear," she said. "You are so kind." Nancy smiled. "It's nothing, really." The woman shook her head. "No, it's not nothing. People don't stop to help each other like this anymore." She took a deep breath, then patted Nancy's hand. "My name is Grandma Lydia." Nancy's heart softened. There was something warm and familiar about the woman, as if she had known her forever. Grandma Lydia sighed, glancing around the market. "If only my grandson could meet a girl like you," she murmured. Nancy chuckled. "Why do you say that?" Grandma Lydia smiled knowingly. "Because he needs someone with a kind heart." Nancy didn't know why, but something about the way she said it made her chest tighten, as if somehow fate had just stepped into her life. She opened her wallet and sighed. She only had a little money left, just enough for either a private cab or lunch for the week. She looked at Grandma Lydia, who still held the bag of fruits with trembling hands. The old woman was kind, gentle, and someone's grandmother. She couldn't just leave her standing in the middle of the busy marketplace alone. Nancy took the money from her wallet and turned to Grandma Lydia with a warm smile. "Take this, Grandma. Use it to take a taxi home." Grandma Lydia's eyes widened in concern. "Oh, my dear, no. I can see you don't have much. You shouldn't spend your money on me." Nancy shook her head playfully. "It's fine, really. I'll just walk to the next bus stop and catch another bus. I am rushing for an interview. If not, I would have personally taken you home. But don't worry about me. If I leave now, I won't be late." Grandma Lydia studied Nancy carefully. There was something about this girl, her selflessness, her warmth. Grandma Lydia smiled to herself. She really is different from most people. "Are you sure you won't be late waiting for another bus?" Grandma Lydia asked again, worry lining her face. Nancy grinned. "I promise, Grandma. Besides, if I get too rich and successful, I might forget the little people, so being a little late isn't such a bad thing." Grandma Lydia chuckled at her playful spirit, but then she grew serious. "Nancy, you are a rare kind of woman. A man would be very lucky to have you." Nancy laughed lightly. "Oh no, Grandma. Don't tell me you're trying to set me up with your grandson again." Grandma Lydia smirked. "Well, maybe I am." Nancy rolled her eyes playfully. I think I'll pass for now. I barely have time for myself. Grandma Lydia sighed, but didn't push further. At least give me your number. If I ever need help, I know you'll be there. Nancy brought out a small notebook, tore a piece, and quickly wrote her phone number. Of course, Grandma. Call me anytime. She gently placed the paper in Grandma Lydia's hands, waved one last time, and then turned, rushing off towards the bus stop. Just as Nancy disappeared into the crowd, a sleek black Rolls-Royce pulled up at the edge of the market. The market people whispered, staring in disbelief at the old woman they all shunned close to the luxury car. The back door swung open, and a tall, handsome man stepped out. He wore a tailored black suit, his posture straight, his presence commanding. His sharp jawline, piercing eyes, and neatly styled dark hair made heads turn as he walked toward Grandma Lydia and gently helped her get into the car. He is none other than Benjamin Lewis, the CEO of Lewis Group. He was one of the richest and most powerful men in the city, but despite his wealth, he rarely smiled, and his eyes were always filled with a cold determination. Grandma, he said firmly, his voice smooth but laced with concern. How many times have I told you not to go out alone without the guards? Grandma Lydia sighed dramatically, waving him off. Oh, Benjamin, I was just taking a little walk. I needed some air. He frowned deeply. In this place, with all the risks, what if something happened to you? Grandma Lydia patted his hand reassuringly. Well, I am fine. I didn't even realize when my wallet got snatched. Benjamin's jaw clenched. What, you were out here all alone without money? She waved it off as nothing. Don't get angry, my boy. A kind young lady stepped in and helped me. Benjamin's eyes softened slightly. Who? A kind-hearted young woman. She was rushing for an interview but still took the time to help me. She even used her last money to get me a cab after she paid for my fruits. Benjamin's expression remained unreadable, but something in his eyes shifted, as if he was trying to understand why someone would do such a thing. Grandma Lydia studied him closely before adding, You should meet her, Benjamin. She would make a good wife for you. Benjamin's expression turned cold instantly. Not this again, Grandma. Grandma Lydia folded her arms. Yes, this again. I told you, he said firmly. I will only marry Rachel. Grandma Lydia sighed, frustrated. Benjamin, Rachel Williams has been missing for 15 years. The Johnson family has tried everything to find her. You have searched for years, and every clue leads to a dead end. Benjamin's eyes darkened, his voice low and serious. I haven't given up my search. I will find Rachel. Grandma Lydia shook her head, placing a gentle hand on his. My boy, I know how much you loved Rachel. But what if she's not coming back? What if fate has something else in store for you? Benjamin looked away, his heart heavy. I made a promise, Grandma, he said softly. She saved your life. She was my very close friend when we were young. She is the only woman I will marry. Grandma Lydia sighed but didn't argue anymore. Instead, she took out the small piece of paper Nancy had written on and held it up. Well, she said with a teasing glint in her eye, at least take this. Benjamin glanced at the scribbled phone number but didn't take it. Grandma Lydia smiled. Fine, I'll keep it for now. He said nothing, staring out at the busy street as the driver quietly drove them back to their mansion. Later that day, Benjamin Lewis sat in his large, glass-walled office at the Lewis Group headquarters, staring blankly at the latest contract on his desk. His head ached. Across from him sat his company's board of directors, his uncle, Mr. Harold Lewis, and a few senior business partners. Benjamin, his uncle said, leaning forward, his voice firm but fatherly, you're one of the most powerful CEOs in this city, but do you know what people see? Benjamin barely lifted his eyes from the contract. A businessman. Harold sighed. No, they see a young man without a stable family life. Investors like stability. They want to know the company will be secure in the future. Benjamin knew where this was going. Marry, Benjamin, one of the senior partners chimed in. It will strengthen your reputation, stabilize the company's image, and assure our investors that Lewis Group has a long, strong future. Benjamin's jaw tightened. This wasn't the first time they had this conversation.
And then there was Grandma Lydia. She had raised him after his parents died. She had been his rock, his only real family left. He would do anything for her. But now, even she wanted him to settle down.
"Meet Nancy," she had said earlier, although she was a stranger she barely knew. He sighed, rubbing his head. "I will marry when I'm ready," he finally said, "and only the woman I choose." Harold exchanged a look with the others before speaking again. The meeting ended, but the weight of expectation still pressed down on his shoulders. Meanwhile, Nancy sat on a bench at the bus stop, staring down at the rejection email on her phone. She had missed the interview. Her one chance at a better job, at escaping the struggles of her home life, gone. Her throat tightened. She wanted to cry, but she didn't regret stopping to help Grandma Lydia. She let out a deep breath, wiped her wet eyes and forced herself to stand up. "I'll find something else," she whispered to herself. "I always do." But as she walked home, a dark feeling settled in her chest. Nancy stepped through the front door of the small, run-down house, her heart sinking the moment she heard her mother's sharp voice. "Where have you been?" Nancy barely had time to answer before her mother, Cynthia, stormed toward her, eyes blazing. "Did you bring money?" Cynthia demanded, arms crossed tightly. Nancy sighed, already exhausted. "Mom, I told you. I had an interview today. I didn't get the job." Her mother's face twisted in anger. "So you spent the whole day doing nothing, and you didn't bring anything home? What kind of daughter are you? You can't even support your own family." Nancy's stomach turned. "I'm trying, Mom. I really am. But you don't even work, and Andrew just wastes money gambling." A loud crash interrupted her words. Her brother, Andrew, had kicked a chair over, glaring at her. "Watch your mouth, Nancy," he spat. Nancy turned on him. "No, you watch your life, Andrew. You don't work. You just sit around and gamble while Mom defends you. Do you even care that we can barely afford to eat?" Her mother grabbed Nancy's wrist, her grip tight and painful. "You ungrateful girl," she hissed. "Do you know how much your brother is suffering? Do you know how much debt he's in?" Nancy ripped her arm away. "That's not my fault. I shouldn't have to fix Andrew's mistakes." Her mother smirked coldly. "Well, you can," she said. "I've already found a way." Nancy's heart stopped. "What do you mean?" Her mother smiled sweetly, the kind of smile that always meant something bad. "Mr. Benson," she said simply. Nancy froze. Her stomach twisted in horror. Mr. Benson was old, very old. He owned a few houses around the area, and he owned a small supermarket close to their home. He wasn't very rich, but rich enough to settle her brother's gambling debts. He had always eyed her like a prize whenever he came to their house. "No," Nancy whispered. Her mother's smile widened. "Yes, he's willing to pay a very generous amount to marry you, enough to clear all of Andrew's gambling debt." Nancy took a step back. "You're selling me," she whispered in disbelief. Her mother's expression turned hard. "I'm saving this family." Nancy's hands shook with rage. "You're not saving anyone. You're just letting Andrew ruin himself while I pay the price." Her mother's palm struck her face so fast she barely saw it coming. A sharp slap echoed in the room. Nancy stumbled, her cheek burning, her eyes stinging with tears. "Enough," Cynthia said coldly. "You're doing this, Nancy, whether you like it or not." Nancy touched her stinging cheek, her entire body trembling. Something inside her broke. Without another word, she turned and ran out of the house, ignoring her mother's shouts behind her. She ran blindly through the streets, her breath coming in short gasps as she fought back her tears. Her cheek still burned from her mother's slap. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing that no matter how hard she worked, no matter how much she sacrificed, it was never enough for her family. She thought of her father, the only person who had ever truly loved her. Before he died, he had always stood up for her. He had shielded her from her mother's harsh words and Andrew's selfishness. But after his passing, everything had changed. Nancy had become the housekeeper, the provider, and the family's only source of income, even though she was only 2 years older than Andrew. And what had she gotten in return?
Nothing but insults, demands, and now, betrayal. Lost in thought, her phone suddenly rang. Nancy startled, quickly wiping her tears before pulling out her phone. Unknown number. She hesitated for a moment, then answered. Hello? A warm, familiar voice spoke. Nancy, my dear, it's Grandma Lydia. Nancy's face softened instantly. Grandma, hope you got home safe. Yes, my dear, Grandma Lydia replied. I wanted to check on you. I hope I'm not calling too late. Nancy glanced around. She had no idea where she was. She had been running aimlessly. No, it's fine, Grandma. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Grandma Lydia's voice became gentle but firm. Come and see me, Nancy. I'll send you my address. Nancy blinked in surprise. Right now? Yes, dear, Grandma Lydia said. If it's not inconvenient. Nancy hesitated, but when her mother's cruel words replayed in her mind, she quickly agreed. I'll be there, she said. Within seconds, she received a message with the address. Nancy typed it into her Maps app, expecting an average location. But when she saw where it led, her eyes widened. She stepped out of the cab, her jaw dropping as she took in the scene before her. The grand estate stood majestically under the night sky, illuminated by golden lights. The massive iron gates, adorned with intricate designs, slowly opened as the guards nodded at her politely. She hesitated. Are you sure this is the right place? She asked the driver, her voice filled with disbelief. The driver chuckled. That's the address you gave me, miss. Looks like someone you know is really rich. Nancy gulped, stepping forward cautiously. The driveway stretched for what felt like miles, lined with perfectly trimmed hedges and luxury cars parked neatly outside. She clutched her bag tightly, suddenly feeling out of place. Before she could second-guess herself, the large oak doors swung open, and Grandma Lydia stepped out, smiling warmly. Nancy, my dear, you're here, she said happily. Nancy slowly walked forward, her gaze still scanning the unbelievable luxury around her. Grandma, this is your house? Grandma Lydia chuckled. Yes, dear, I live here with my grandson. Nancy's eyes widened further. Come inside, Grandma Lydia urged, leading her through the doors. Nancy stepped in and immediately felt overwhelmed. The grand chandelier in the center of the ceiling sparkled like diamonds. The marble floors shone so brightly she could see her reflection. The expensive furniture, gold accents, and elegant decor made it look like something out of a movie. Nancy exhaled slowly. She had never been inside a house this grand in her entire life. I don't know what to say, she admitted. This place is breathtaking. Grandma Lydia laughed. It's just a house, dear. What matters is the people inside. Nancy turned to her. You said you live here with your grandson? Grandma Lydia nodded. Yes, but he isn't home from work yet. Nancy felt curiosity spark inside her. Who exactly was her grandson? Grandma Lydia led Nancy to a cozy sitting area, far from the intimidating luxury of the main hall. This is my favorite spot, Grandma Lydia said, sitting comfortably. It's quiet and peaceful. Nancy relaxed a little as a housekeeper brought in tea and biscuits. As they sipped their tea, Grandma Lydia asked about her interview. Nancy sighed. I missed it. Grandma Lydia frowned. Oh dear, I'm so sorry. Which company was it? Lewis Group, Nancy said, stirring her tea absently. Grandma Lydia's eyes twinkled with amusement, but she said nothing for a moment. Nancy didn't notice. I guess it wasn't meant to be. Grandma Lydia smiled knowingly. You never know, my dear. Sometimes fate works in mysterious ways. Nancy sighed and leaned back, feeling a little better. She had expected to feel worse, but something about Grandma Lydia's presence was comforting. Why don't you stay the night? Grandma Lydia suggested suddenly. Nancy blinked in surprise. What? No, It's already late, Grandma Lydia pointed out. Nancy stiffened. Stay, Grandma Lydia insisted gently. It's just for one night. I'll have a guest room prepared. Nancy hesitated, but deep down she didn't want to go home. Okay, she finally said with a small smile. I'll stay. Grandma Lydia patted her hand. Good. Nancy exhaled. letting herself relax for the first time in days. Meanwhile, a sleek black car pulled into the driveway. The driver stepped out first, then opened the passenger door. Benjamin Lewis stepped out, removing his suit jacket and rolling his sleeves up. He was tired, but the moment he saw his grandmother's favorite sitting area lit up from the inside, he frowned. "Grandma's still awake," he murmured. He had no idea that inside the mansion, the woman his grandmother had told him about, the woman she wanted him to meet, was already there, sleeping just a few doors away from his own room. Nancy stretched sleepily, feeling the softness of the bed beneath her. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Then, as she opened her eyes and saw the elegant bedroom, memories from the night before flooded back. She was in Grandma Lydia's mansion. She sat up quickly, glancing at the clock. It was morning already. She had never slept this peacefully before. There was a soft knock on the door before a maid entered. "Good morning, Miss Nancy," the maid said with a warm smile. "Madam Lydia asks that you join her for breakfast in the dining hall." Nancy nodded, quickly getting out of bed. She freshened up and changed into the simple clothes she had brought along. As she made her way downstairs, she took a deep breath, still unable to believe she was here. She entered the grand dining hall where Grandma Lydia sat gracefully at the head of the table. But she wasn't alone. Sitting beside her was a tall, handsome man, dressed in a white designer shirt. His sharp jawline, neatly styled hair, and deep-set eyes gave him an air of authority and power. Nancy froze in shock. She knew that face. Benjamin Lewis, the CEO of Lewis Group. Her heartbeat quickened. "He's Grandma Lydia's grandson." Benjamin looked up at her, his face unreadable. Grandma Lydia beamed. "Nancy, come sit, dear." Nancy slowly walked over, trying to calm herself. Grandma Lydia gestured between them. "Benjamin, this is Nancy, the kind young woman I told you about." Benjamin's expression didn't change. He simply nodded. "I remember." Nancy, nervous under his intense gaze, quickly said, "It's nice to finally meet you." Benjamin nodded again but remained silent. Then, Grandma Lydia spoke again. "Benjamin, dear," she said sweetly, "Nancy needs a job." Nancy's eyes widened. "Grandma, she missed her interview at your company because she was helping me," Grandma Lydia continued. "You should give her a job." Nancy turned bright red. "Grandma, really, you don't have to." Benjamin finally spoke, his voice smooth yet commanding. "What are your qualifications?" Nancy swallowed hard, suddenly feeling like she was in an actual interview. I have a degree in business administration," she said quickly. "I also have experience in marketing and project management." Benjamin studied her, his sharp eyes assessing her carefully. After a few seconds, he finally said, "Impressive." Nancy blinked in surprise. Then he turned to his grandmother. "She can start tomorrow," he said simply. Nancy's mouth fell open, just like that. "Thank you," she said quickly, still processing everything. Benjamin simply nodded. "I'll have the HR department prepare your contract." Nancy couldn't believe it. After everything that had happened, she suddenly had a new job, at Lewis Group no less. The following morning, Nancy started her new job at Lewis Group, working as a marketing assistant in the company. She was determined to prove herself, and within a few days her supervisors were already impressed with her work. But one thing bothered her. Though she worked for Benjamin, he rarely spoke to her. Their interactions were cold and strictly professional. It was clear to Nancy that he was a man who didn't mix personal matters with work. That was fine with her. At least it was, until Grandma Lydia dropped a bombshell one evening. Nancy was having dinner with Grandma Lydia at the mansion when the older woman suddenly smiled mysteriously. "Nancy, dear," she said, "I have an idea." Nancy looked up, curious. "What is it?" Grandma Lydia took a sip of her tea before saying casually, "You should marry Benjamin." Nancy choked on her drink. "What?" Grandma Lydia smirked. "I think you two would make a wonderful couple." Nancy stared at her in disbelief. "Grandma, She shook her head quickly. "We barely know each other. Benjamin doesn't even..." I'm not asking you to fall in love overnight, Grandma Lydia interrupted. I'm asking you to help each other. Nancy's heart pounded. What do you mean? Grandma Lydia leaned forward. Tell me about your parents, Nancy. Nancy stiffened for a split second before forcing a small smile. They passed away when I was younger. Grandma Lydia's face softened. I'm sorry to hear that. So you live alone? Nancy nodded quickly. Yes, I do. She kept her voice steady, but inside her heart was racing. She knew what her mother and Andrew were capable of. If they knew about Benjamin and his grandmother's wealth, they would try to extort them immediately. Her mother would show up crying, demanding money, playing the victim. Andrew would pretend to be desperate, promising to change, only to waste everything gambling again. She refused to let that happen. She had already seen the disapproval in Benjamin's eyes, the way he clearly didn't trust her. She didn't want to prove him right, so she kept the truth hidden. I see, Grandma Lydia said gently. That must be tough. Nancy simply smiled. I manage. Grandma Lydia studied her for a moment before speaking again. Well, I think you and Benjamin should get married. Nancy's breath hitched. She had no way out. She knows what her mother is capable of, and Mr. Benson wouldn't stop until he had her. Grandma Lydia was right. Marrying Benjamin would protect her. And, if she was being honest, a part of her was attracted to him. She wasn't sure if she could call it love, especially knowing he didn't feel the same way. But there was something about him that made her heart race. Taking a deep breath, she nodded slowly. I'll do it. When Grandma Lydia told Benjamin her proposal, he immediately refused. Marry her? No way. You know Rachel is the one for me, he said coldly. Grandma Lydia sighed. Benjamin, be reasonable. This will give Nancy a family and help you. Benjamin stiffened. He knew she was right. The board wouldn't pressure him anymore. Investors would trust him more. And most importantly, he could use this as a temporal fix to stall for time. After several minutes of silence, he finally spoke. I have conditions, he said. Grandma Lydia smiled. Of course. No one can know, he said firmly. Not at work, not in public, not even my business partners. Grandma Lydia blinked in surprise. Why? Benjamin's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. Because deep down, he still believed he would find Rachel. This marriage would be temporary, just a shield to get his grandmother and business partners off his back. And when he found Rachel, he would annul the marriage with Nancy and marry her. Nancy, still surprised that he agreed so quickly, didn't argue or question him. She knew what she was getting into. She knew this wasn't love, but a part of her still wished deep down that it could be. The moment Benjamin agreed to the marriage, Grandma Lydia couldn't contain her excitement. My boy, she said, beaming, you won't regret this. Benjamin remained silent, his expression unreadable. Nancy forced a small smile, feeling a mix of relief, nervousness, and something else she couldn't quite name. Grandma Lydia held Nancy's hands. I know you'll take care of him, she said warmly. And I know he'll take care of you too, even if he doesn't realize it yet. Nancy swallowed hard. She wasn't sure about that. Benjamin had made it very clear that this marriage was nothing more than an arrangement. Still, she nodded. I'll do my best. Benjamin exhaled sharply and turned to his assistant. Prepare everything for the registry. We'll get it done immediately. His tone was cold, businesslike. Nancy pretended it didn't hurt. A few days later, Benjamin and Nancy stood before the marriage registrar, signing their names on a piece of paper that would make them husband and wife, on paper at least. There was no grand wedding, no family members, no friends. Just Benjamin, Nancy, Grandma Lydia, and 2 legal witnesses. Nancy watched as Benjamin signed his name with practiced ease, as if this was nothing more than another business contract. Her heart clenched, but she didn't let it show. Then it was her turn. She picked up the pen and signed Nancy Okoro Lewis. The registrar stamped the papers and smiled. Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Lewis. Nancy felt a strange flutter in her chest at those words. Mrs. Lewis. It wasn't real, but still, it felt strange to hear. Grandma Lydia clapped her hands happily, pulling Nancy into a warm hug. "Welcome to the family, my dear." Nancy smiled softly, the warmth of Grandma Lydia's embrace comforting her. Benjamin stood stiffly beside them, his face impassive. He was already thinking ahead, planning for the day this marriage would be dissolved once he found Rachel. But for now, he had done what was expected. With the document signed, they had a small private ceremony at Grandma Lydia's mansion. Nothing fancy, just a quiet dinner where they exchanged rings for formality. Nancy looked down at the simple yet elegant ring on her finger. It was beautiful, but it didn't mean anything. At least not to him. The first night in Benjamin's massive penthouse, Nancy wasn't sure what to expect. When they arrived, he simply handed her a key and said, "Your room is down the hall. We'll live under the same roof, but that's all this is." Nancy nodded, pretending that didn't sting. She wasn't attracted to him. At least, that's what she told herself. She shouldn't care that he sounded so detached. "Got it," she replied, her voice even. She went to her room, closing the door behind her. For the first time in her life, she had a place to call her own. It wasn't home, but at least it was safe. At work, nothing changed. No one knew that Nancy was now Mrs. Lewis. Not his employees, not even his best friend, Daniel Carter. Nancy didn't act like a CEO's wife. She continued working hard, refusing to rely on Benjamin's money. She didn't ask for luxury cars or expensive gifts. She took the subway to work just like before. She bought her own coffee and worked overtime just like any other employee. She kept her distance from Benjamin at work. To everyone, she was just another employee. And Benjamin? He watched her from afar, secretly impressed. At first, he thought she might take advantage of their situation, demand things, expect privileges, use his name. But she didn't. She never even mentioned their marriage once. And for some reason, that bothered him. One evening, Benjamin arrived home late after a long day. He expected the penthouse to be quiet and empty, but instead he found Nancy sitting on the couch, laptop open, working late. She looked up in surprise. "Oh, you're back." He raised a brow. "You're still working?" She nodded. "Yes, I had some reports to finish." He studied her closely. She wasn't watching TV or lounging around in luxury. She was working hard, just like always. He had never met a woman like her before. Without a word, he turned and went to his room. But that night, as he lay in bed, he found himself thinking about her. She was nothing like what he had expected. And that was beginning to unsettle him. Nancy was beginning to feel at peace in her new life. She had a job she loved, a place to sleep without fear, and though her marriage to Benjamin wasn't a romantic one, it gave her the protection she needed. But peace never lasted long when it came to her family. It started with a phone call. She was at work when her phone buzzed with an unknown number. She hesitated before answering. "Hello? Nancy?" A desperate voice came through the line. She froze. "Andrew." Her heart tightened. "What do you want?" she asked, her tone cold. "Nancy, please. I need your help. I'm in deep trouble," Andrew pleaded. Nancy closed her eyes, already knowing what was coming. "How much?" she said flatly. There was a pause. Then in a small, guilty voice he said, "I owe $2 million. Nancy's grip tightened around her phone. $2 million? She repeated in disbelief. "Andrew, how did you—" "I messed up, okay?" Andrew cut in, his voice shaking. "These guys, they're dangerous, Nancy. If I don't pay, they'll kill me." Nancy felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. It was always like this. Andrew gambled. He lost. He begged for money. Their mother defended him. Nancy was done cleaning up his messes. "I don't have the money," she said firmly. Andrew scoffed. "What do you mean? You live in a mansion now. You're married to a very rich man." Nancy's stomach dropped. "How do you know that?"
she asked slowly. Andrew's voice turned smug. Mom found out after she refused to pick any of our calls. We just knew you have selfishly found a luxurious life for only yourself. Nancy gritted her teeth. Her mother had always been good at finding ways to ruin her life. I'm not giving you any money. I do not owe you and Mom anything, she said sharply. Andrew's tone turned cold. Then don't blame me for what happens next. Nancy's blood ran cold. The line went dead. A few days later, Nancy received another call, this time from her mother. Nancy, my daughter. Her mother's voice was sweet, too sweet. Can we talk? Nancy almost refused, but something told her she needed to end this once and for all. I'll come, she said. Nancy arrived at her home, her guard up. Her mother greeted her with a smile. Come in, dear, let's have dinner together. Nancy hesitated, but she stepped inside. She barely had time to register the odd smell before she felt her body go weak. Her vision blurred. Her legs gave out beneath her. The last thing she saw was Andrew's guilty face before darkness swallowed her whole. Nancy woke up with her wrists tied to a chair. Her head pounded. She tried to move, but her body still felt weak from the drug. She's awake, a deep voice said. Nancy snapped her head up. She was in a dimly lit hotel room. And sitting across from her, a sleazy smile on his face, was Mr. Benson. Fear clawed at her throat. Finally, he said, his hungry eyes scanning her. I've waited a long time for this, Nancy. Nancy struggled against her binds. You have no right? Mr. Benson laughed. Oh, but I do. Your mother sold you to me. Nancy felt sick. She wouldn't, she whispered. But even as she said it, she knew it was true. Oh, she would, Mr. Benson said gleefully. And she did. I paid your brother's debt. You belong to me. Nancy refused to cry. She refused to break. You won't get away with this. I am married. Let me go, she said through gritted teeth. Mr. Benson just smirked. And who's going to stop me, your fake husband? Then, as if on cue, the door burst open. And standing there, fury burning in his eyes, was Benjamin Lewis. Mr. Benson barely had time to react before Benjamin grabbed him by the collar and slammed him against the wall. You dare touch my wife? Benjamin's voice was dangerously low. Mr. Benson gasped, struggling against Benjamin's grip. I paid for her. Benjamin's jaw clenched. She's not for sale. Then, without another word, Benjamin punched him in the face. Nancy flinched at the impact. Mr. Benson crashed to the floor, groaning. Benjamin turned to Nancy, his anger softening slightly. He quickly untied her hands. Are you okay? Nancy nodded shakily. Benjamin turned back to Mr. Benson, his voice cold. If you ever come near her again, I'll make sure you regret it. Mr. Benson stayed silent, holding his bleeding nose. Benjamin grabbed Nancy's hand, leading her out of the room without looking back. The ride home was silent. Nancy kept stealing glances at Benjamin, waiting for the explosion. Waiting for him to say, you lied to me. She had told him she was an orphan. Now he knew the truth. Her mother was a greedy monster. Her brother was a parasite. Nancy clenched her fists. She had expected him to be furious, to tell her he wanted nothing to do with her anymore. Instead, he simply asked, Did they hurt you? Nancy blinked, startled. No, you came just in time. He didn't press her for more. He didn't demand an explanation. Instead, he just said, They won't touch you again. I made sure of that. Nancy's heart ached. He wasn't angry. He didn't blame her. He just wanted to protect her. Something deep inside her shifted. For the first time, she realized she had fallen completely in love with him, and there was nothing she could do about it. Nancy had never felt as safe as she did when Benjamin rescued her from her family's cruelty. For the first time, she felt like she truly belonged somewhere, that someone cared enough to fight for her. And in the days that followed, Benjamin's cold demeanor began to change. He wasn't as distant as before. At breakfast, he would ask how she was feeling. At night, when he returned home from work, he would check if she had eaten. It was small things,
but they meant everything to Nancy, and it gave her hope. Maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to feel something for her too. Maybe he was falling in love with her, just as she had with him. But hope was a dangerous thing. Because just when Nancy thought she was truly happy, her world came crashing down. One evening, Benjamin was at a formal charity gala, representing Lewis Group, when an announcement changed everything. "We are pleased to introduce Miss Rachel Williams," the host declared. The room fell silent, gasps echoing across the hall. Rachel Williams, the long-lost heiress of the influential Williams family. Nancy wasn't at the event, but the news spread quickly. The story was all over the media the next morning. Rachel Williams, who had been missing for 15 years, had finally been found. She had grown up in an orphanage before DNA tests confirmed her identity. Her parents were overjoyed to have her back. And what caught Nancy's attention the most? The article mentioned that Rachel had been engaged to Benjamin as a child before she was taken away. That wasn't all. There was also an official press release confirming Rachel's return. The Williams family made a public statement, welcoming her back into their lives and thanking everyone who had helped in the search over the years. Nancy's heart sank, and although she was happy that William had their daughter back, she could not help feeling lost. Benjamin had spent his entire life searching for her, and now she was back. That meant their marriage was over. The moment Benjamin heard the news, he couldn't believe it. Rachel? After all these years? He had searched for her everywhere, followed every lead, but they had all turned into dead ends. Yet here she was, alive. Benjamin needed to be sure. He needed proof that she was truly Rachel. So he began spending time with her. He visited the Williams mansion. He tried to recount childhood memories with Rachel, but she always shook her head, a sad look in her eyes.
"I'm sorry, Ben," she said softly. "I don't remember much. It's been so long."
Benjamin didn't mind. "We'll create new ones," he told her. Nancy felt sick when she read that line in one of the gossip magazines. Benjamin had spent years waiting for Rachel, and now he was ready to start over with her. As long as she was back, that was all that mattered to him. Nancy didn't stand a chance. At first, Nancy tried to convince herself it didn't matter. "He never loved me anyway," she told herself. "I was just a stand-in." But the pain didn't listen. She saw the way he smiled with Rachel, how he looked at her like she was his world. She watched from a distance as he spent more and more time away from home. She heard him take calls late at night, his voice gentle when speaking to Rachel in a way it had never been with her. Nancy felt like a fool. She had let herself believe, just for a moment, that Benjamin cared about her. That maybe, just maybe, he could love her the way she loved him. But she had been wrong. Terribly wrong. She was just a temporary replacement. Nancy knew she never stood a chance against Rachel. Rachel was his childhood love. She was the one he had been searching for all his life. She was just a convenience. A temporary placeholder until Rachel returned. Now that Rachel was back, Nancy was nothing. She was just the woman he had married out of duty, not out of love. And the worst part, it hurt more than she ever imagined it would. She hadn't planned to fall in love with him, but she had. One evening, Nancy was walking past the private lounge in their penthouse when she heard Benjamin's voice. She wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but his words froze her in place. "I can't believe you're really here," he said softly. Nancy's heart squeezed. Then came Rachel's voice, just as soft, just as familiar. "I always knew you'd never give up on me, Ben." Nancy's throat tightened. Rachel called him Ben. She had never dared to call him that. "I missed you so much. I thought we will never find you. I'm so glad your parents never gave up," Benjamin murmured. Nancy's chest ached. She had never heard him say those words to anyone before. Not to her. Not even once. And in that moment,
Nancy knew the truth. Benjamin had never been hers, and he never would be. Later that night, Nancy sat by the window of her bedroom, staring at the city lights with a heavy heart. She had made her decision. She had loved Benjamin in silence. Nancy knew she had to leave. She couldn't spend every day watching him fall deeper into Rachel's world while she stood on the sidelines, forgotten. The next morning, Nancy knocked on Grandma Lydia's door, taking a deep breath before stepping inside. The elderly woman smiled warmly, but as soon as she saw Nancy's sad expression, her face fell. "What's wrong, dear?" she asked gently. Nancy swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay strong. "I've decided to leave," she said softly. Grandma Lydia's smile vanished. "Leave?" Nancy nodded, her throat tight. I love Benjamin," she admitted for the first time. "But love can't be forced. I know he doesn't feel the same way." Grandma Lydia reached for her hand. "Nancy, dear, don't rush this decision. Benjamin is complicated. He's blinded by his past." Nancy shook her head. "No, Grandma. He's not blinded. He's just in love. And it's not with me." Grandma Lydia sighed deeply, sadness filling her eyes. "I want him to be happy," Nancy continued, her voice trembling, "and I can't stand in his way." The room fell into silence. Grandma Lydia studied Nancy's face, seeing the pain hidden behind her strength. Finally, the older woman nodded slowly. "I understand," she said quietly. Nancy exhaled shakily, relieved but also heartbroken. Grandma Lydia walked over to her desk, pulling out a checkbook. She wrote down a large sum and held it out to Nancy. "Take this," she insisted. "It will help you start over." Nancy looked at the check, but she didn't reach for it. Instead, she shook her head. "No, Grandma," she said softly. "I want to stand on my own 2 feet." Tears welled up in Grandma Lydia's eyes as she placed the check back down. "You're an incredible woman, Nancy," she whispered. "Benjamin is a fool for letting you go." Nancy forced a small smile, blinking back her own tears. "Take care of yourself, Grandma." And with that, she walked away, leaving everything behind. As the door closed behind her, Grandma Lydia sat back in her chair, her heart aching. She had lost the best thing that had ever happened to Benjamin, and she knew one day he would realize it too. Nancy wasted no time starting over. She filed for divorce, cutting all ties with Benjamin before he even noticed she was gone. She moved into a small apartment, far from the penthouse she had once shared with him. She found a new job at a small marketing company, determined to rebuild her life from scratch. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hers. She wasn't Mrs. Lewis anymore. She was just Nancy. And for the first time in a long time, she had to learn how to live without him. But that was easier said than done. Because no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't erase him from her heart. Meanwhile, Benjamin should have been happy. Rachel was back. The girl he had searched for his entire life was finally with him. But something wasn't right. At first, he had made excuses for her memory loss. It was normal, he told himself. 15 years was a long time. Of course, she wouldn't remember everything. But the more time he spent with her, the more he realized this wasn't the Rachel he remembered. The Rachel he had loved as a child had been kind and humble. She had always helped people, always smiled even in hardship. But this Rachel, she was nothing like that. She ordered the maids around, yelling at them for small mistakes. She spent money carelessly, shopping for expensive jewelry and designer clothes without hesitation. She had no interest in work, always finding excuses to avoid responsibilities. At first, Benjamin tried to ignore it. But one evening, he overheard Rachel yelling at a maid for bringing her the wrong flavor of tea. "I said jasmine, you idiot. Are you deaf?" The maid flinched, looking close to tears. Benjamin's stomach twisted. This wasn't Rachel. At least, not the Rachel he had loved. Or was he clinging to a memory that no longer existed? Benjamin didn't say anything that night, but the doubt in his heart grew stronger. He wanted to believe Rachel was who she said she was. He wanted to trust the DNA test the Williams family had done. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. And he was starting to wonder, had he made the biggest mistake of his life? Benjamin sat at his desk, staring at the DNA report in his hands. His fingers tightened around the paper. Rachel wasn't the Williams' lost daughter. It had taken him weeks to put the pieces together. At first, he had ignored his doubts, convincing himself that Rachel's changed personality was due to the years she had spent away from her family, the way she had manipulated situations to get what she wanted. But the more he investigated, the more suspicious things became. Benjamin had gone to the hospital where the initial DNA test was done, wanting to confirm the results. And that's when he discovered the truth. Rachel hadn't just lied. She had seduced the doctor, convincing him to forge the results. She had taken advantage of the fact that she shared the same first name as the real heiress. It was a carefully planned deception, and the Williams family had fallen for it completely. She knew they were desperate to find their daughter, and she had capitalized on that fact. But not anymore. Benjamin was about to expose everything. The Williams mansion was silent as Benjamin walked inside. Rachel sat between Mr. and Mrs. Williams, looking every bit like the perfect daughter. She smiled up at him, but Benjamin could see the nervous flicker in her eyes. "Benjamin, darling," she said sweetly, "you should have called before coming over." He ignored her. Instead, he turned to Mr. and Mrs. Williams, his voice firm. "I need to speak with you," he said. Something in his tone made them tense up. "What's wrong?" Mrs. Williams asked. Benjamin placed the DNA report on the table, his eyes locked onto Rachel's face. "This test was a lie," he said. Silence. Rachel's smile faltered. Mr. Williams frowned. "What do you mean?" Benjamin's voice hardened. "She isn't your daughter." Mrs. Williams gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "That's impossible. The DNA test was forged," Benjamin interrupted. Rachel's face went pale. Mrs. Williams turned to Rachel. "Tell him he's wrong." Rachel forced a laugh, but her voice was shaky. "Of course he's wrong. Why would I fake something like that?" Benjamin's eyes narrowed. "Because you wanted the Williams name. You wanted their wealth." Rachel's breath hitched. Benjamin took a step closer, his voice low and dangerous. "I went to the hospital myself. I spoke to the staff, and I had a private investigation done. Remember the doctor you used to forge the fake result? He confessed fearing he might lose his license." Rachel's hands trembled. Mrs. Williams turned to her. Tears filled her eyes. "Rachel, tell me this isn't true," she whispered. Rachel looked around desperately, trying to find an excuse, but there was nothing she could say. Because she had been caught. Mr. Williams's face darkened. "We lost our daughter once," he said quietly, "and now we've lost her again." Rachel stood up suddenly. "No!" "Enough," Benjamin cut in. Rachel flinched at the coldness in his voice. She had lost, and she knew it. As Benjamin drove home that night, his mind was a storm of emotions. He had spent years searching for Rachel, believing she was the only woman he could ever love. And now, she was a fraud. And even worse, he realized something far more painful. He hadn't fallen in love with Rachel the woman. He had been in love with the memories. The girl from his past, the one who had been kind, selfless, and pure-hearted. Rachel had never been that girl. And he had been chasing a dream that never really existed. But as he stepped into the empty penthouse, a different ache filled his chest. Nancy, the real woman who had unknowingly come to love and care about. The one who had cared for him, even when he had been too blind to see it. She was gone. The next morning, Benjamin sat in his office, feeling a rare sense of relief. Rachel was exposed. The Williams family was free from her lies, and now he could finally move forward. But even as he told himself that everything was settled, he felt a strange emptiness. His mind kept drifting back to Nancy. It had been weeks since she left, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't stop missing her presence. He had thought he loved Rachel, but the truth was clear now. He had been blind to the one woman who had truly cared for him, and he had let her go. Later, that evening, Benjamin was about to leave his office when his private investigator walked in, looking unusually tense. "Sir," the investigator said, placing a folder on the desk. "I found something you need to see." Benjamin frowned. "What is it?" The investigator hesitated. "A blood donation record from years ago." Benjamin's heart skipped a beat. His grandmother's accident. He flipped open the folder and scanned the yellowed document, and then his entire world stopped. There, listed as the blood donor, was a name he never expected to see. Nancy Okoro. Benjamin's breath caught in his throat. Nancy. Nancy had been the girl all along. She was the real Rachel Williams. She was the one he had been searching for all his life. And he had pushed her away. His hands tightened around the file, a wave of regret crashing into him. "I have to find her," he said, standing up abruptly. But before he could, his phone rang. It was an unknown number. He answered, and a voice sent chills down his spine. "Mr. Lewis," the voice sneered. "If you want your wife back, you better send 5 million to this account and I will tell you who took her. But if you do not send the money, then don't worry. When we're done with her, you won't want her anymore." The call ended. Benjamin's heart stopped. Nancy was in danger. And this time, he wasn't going to lose her. Nancy woke up groggily, her wrists bound tightly behind her. Her head throbbed as she tried to piece together what had happened. She had received a call from her mother, Lady Cynthia, to meet her urgently, and although she knew her mother had always been up to no good, she didn't want to ignore her completely. She had agreed to meet her out of respect. Then, as soon as she got to the said location, a van had suddenly pulled up, and before she could react, a cloth had been pressed against her mouth. Now, she was in a dark, filthy warehouse, and standing in front of her was Rachel. Nancy's stomach twisted in horror. Rachel's face was twisted in pure rage. "You really are a nuisance," she sneered. Nancy glared up at her. "What do you want?" Rachel let out a cruel laugh. "Oh, sweetheart, it's not about what I want. It's about what Benjamin doesn't get." Nancy's blood ran cold. Rachel smirked. "You see, I can't have you running back into his arms. Benjamin is mine, and if I can't have him, then you won't either. So I've made sure that won't ever happen." She snapped her fingers, and suddenly, a group of dangerous-looking men stepped into the room. Nancy's chest tightened in terror. Rachel crouched down, whispering in her ear, "Gentlemen, enjoy her all you want. After tonight, Benjamin will never want you again." Nancy struggled against the ropes, panic gripping her. But before she could scream for help, a new voice made her freeze. "Well, well," came a familiar mocking voice. Nancy turned and felt her heart break all over again. Her mother, Madam Cynthia, stood at the doorway, smirking. Nancy's body went numb. "Mom," she whispered. "You're working with her." Madam Cynthia shrugged. "Rachel offered me a good deal." Nancy felt sick. "You're selling me out to a stranger?" she asked in disbelief. Rachel laughed. "Stranger? Oh, Nancy, didn't your mother ever tell you the truth?" Nancy's breath caught. She turned back to Cynthia, eyes wide with confusion. Her mother smirked. "You're not even my real daughter." Nancy felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. What?" she choked out. Cynthia folded her arms. "I found you 15 years ago. You had been in an accident and had lost your memories. You didn't even remember your name or your parents' name when you woke up. You called me Mom. My husband and I were childless, so we took you in. Then I had Andrew and, well, I didn't need you anymore." Nancy's entire world shattered. Everything made sense now. Her mother's hatred, her favoritism toward Andrew, the way she had always treated Nancy like an outsider. Nancy closed her eyes, her heart aching in ways she never thought possible. "So you never loved me," she whispered.
Cynthia smirked. You were never mine to love. Tears burned in Nancy's eyes, but before she could respond, a deafening crash echoed through the warehouse. And then, gunshots. Nancy barely had time to react before men in black suits flooded the warehouse, and at the center of them all was Benjamin. His eyes burned with fury, his body radiating pure rage. "Get your hands off my wife," he said in a deadly voice. Rachel took a stumbling step back. "But Benjamin!" But before she could speak, Benjamin grabbed her by the wrist and shoved her toward his men. "Take her away," he ordered coldly. Rachel screamed, struggling, but it was too late. The police had arrived, and she was finished. Nancy turned toward Madame Cynthia, who stood frozen in place. Benjamin's eyes darkened. "You are not her mother," he said, his voice sharp as steel. "You lost the right to call yourself that the moment you sold her out." He turned to the officers. "Take her too." Madame Cynthia screamed as the police dragged her away. Nancy watched in silence, feeling nothing but emptiness. And then, suddenly, she felt arms wrap around her. Warm, strong, safe. Benjamin. Nancy finally let herself collapse into his chest, tears falling freely. He held her tightly, his grip never faltering. "I'm so sorry, Nancy," he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. Nancy gripped his shirt, sobbing against him. For the first time in forever, she finally felt like she belonged somewhere. Not with Cynthia, not with Andrew, but with Benjamin. And this time, she wasn't going to let go. Nancy sat quietly in the hospital room, her heart pounding as she watched the doctor hand Benjamin the DNA test results. Her real DNA test. Benjamin's hands shook slightly as he opened the file, scanning the report with intense eyes. Then, he looked up at her. His expression was a mix of relief, awe, and something deeper. "It's true," he whispered. "You are Rachel Williams." Nancy's heart stopped just for a moment. After Cynthia's confession, she had wondered who she really was. Now, she finally had her answer. She wasn't the poor, abandoned girl Cynthia had treated like a burden. She was Rachel Nancy Williams, the true heiress of Star Group. Hours later, Nancy stood in front of the Grand Williams mansion, her heart racing. The large doors swung open, revealing Mr. and Mrs. Williams standing in the doorway. Nancy's mother, Mrs. Williams, let out a soft gasp, her hands flying to her mouth. "Nancy?" Nancy felt tears sting her eyes. She didn't remember them, but something inside her recognized them. They were her parents. Before she could say a word, Mrs. Williams rushed forward, wrapping her arms around her. "My baby," she sobbed, holding her tightly. "I thought I lost you forever." Nancy closed her eyes, letting the warmth of her mother's embrace wash over her. Mr. Williams soon joined, hugging them both. "You're home," he whispered. "You're finally home, oh God, we thank you." Days later, a grand ball was held to announce Nancy's return to the world. The true heiress of Star Group had come home. The event was magnificent, attended by the richest and most powerful in the country. As Nancy stepped into the ballroom in a stunning white gown, she felt the weight of a new identity on her shoulders. She was no longer just Nancy Okoro. She was Rachel Nancy Williams. She was not just Mrs. Lewis. She was the rightful owner of Star Group. The night was perfect, but nothing could prepare her for what happened next. As the music softened, Benjamin suddenly walked onto the stage, taking the microphone. Nancy watched, confused, as all eyes turned to him. Then he turned to her. His gaze was soft, intense, full of something she had never seen before. With slow, deliberate steps, he walked toward her. Nancy's heart pounded. Then, in front of the entire world, Benjamin got down on one knee. A collective gasp filled the ballroom. Nancy's eyes widened in shock. "Benjamin." His voice was steady, deep, and filled with emotion. "Rachel Nancy Williams," he began, holding out a velvet box with a breathtaking diamond ring inside. "I once promised myself that I would marry Rachel, that I would love her forever. But what I didn't realize back then was that Rachel wasn't just a name.
Nancy's breath hitched. Benjamin's eyes never left hers. I don't love you because you're Rachel Williams. He took a deep breath, his voice growing even more raw. I love you because you are Nancy.
The woman who stood by me when I was blind. The woman who loved me even when I didn't deserve it. The woman who taught me what it really means to love. Nancy's throat tightened. The entire room was silent. Then, in a strong, unwavering voice, Benjamin spoke the words that changed everything. I don't want to hide anymore. I don't want to pretend. I don't want a contract marriage. I want you, only you. And I want the whole world to know. Nancy felt tears slip down her cheeks. Benjamin's voice softened. Will you marry me again, Nancy? But this time, for real? A deep silence filled the ballroom. Everyone waited. Grandma Lydia wiped away happy tears, smiling as if she had known this moment would come. Nancy's hands trembled as she covered her mouth, overwhelmed with emotion. Then, with a voice full of love, she whispered, yes. The entire ballroom erupted in cheers. Benjamin stood up immediately, slipping the ring onto her finger. Then, without hesitation, he pulled her into his arms and kissed her. As the night went on, Nancy looked around at the people she loved. Her parents, standing proudly by her side. Grandma Lydia, beaming with joy. Benjamin, holding her hand like he never wanted to let go. She had spent so long believing she was alone. But now, she knew the truth. She had been found, not just as Rachel Williams, but as Nancy. And in Benjamin's eyes, that was the woman he had always been searching for. As Grandma Lydia watched them dance together, she smiled to herself. Two hearts meant for each other, she whispered softly, will always find their way back, no matter how long they are separated. And with that, Nancy and Benjamin's story truly began.